Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Phillipson. I'm the Dean of the College of Law, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the College this afternoon for this exciting event. I would like to begin by saying, as we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Today's event marks the third in a series of special events featuring former Prime Ministers of Canada who have been invited to the University of Saskatchewan to reflect on Canada's past, present, and future direction. I'd like to greatly acknowledge the University of Saskatchewan Canada 150 project as our partners in hosting this event today, and to thank Catherine Warden and her team for their coordination. I'd also like to thank McKercher LLP for their sponsorship of this event as part of the College of Law's lecture series. Their support allows us to continue to present a wide range of informative, educational, and entertaining speakers to the college and the wider community. I encourage all of you, particularly those of you who aren't usually on campus, to look at the list of speakers that we have. We have a wonderful array of speakers, and all the events are open to the public, and I encourage you to come and visit these events and to fully participate. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Marie Stack, daughter of John A. Stack, to bring greetings on behalf of the Stack family. Marie is an alumnus of the College of Law. She had the misfortune of learning property law from me, and she is a partner in the Saskatoon office of McKercher LLP. So please join me in welcoming Marie Stack.
So I was just asked to say a couple of words about John Stack. So I'll make it brief, but John Stack was born in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan in 1937. He entered the University of Saskatchewan, where he attended St. Thomas More College. He received a Bachelor's of Arts degree and a degree in law in 1961. He became a senior partner in McKercher Law Firm, where he developed a very successful corporate commercial practice. He also lectured at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. John was a director of the Bank of Canada for 12 years, including 9 years as a member of the Executive Committee. He was also a director of Saskatoon Trust and a founding director of BioStar. He was a member and chair of a number of charities and nonprofit boards, including St. Thomas More College and St. Anne's Citizen Village. He was a lifelong member of the Liberal Party, holding key positions for the party both in Saskatchewan and in federal organizations. John was also active in the Catholic Church. He was a Knight of Malta and a fourth degree member of the Knights of Columbus. My father was very engaged in the political process and a strong advocate of public service, and the Stack family is very proud to have the Right Honorable Paul Martin as the speaker today. We would like to thank Mr. Martin for agreeing to speak with us today and the Honorable Mr. Romano for emceeing this event. And we would also like to thank McKercher Law Firm for funding the lecture, the University of Saskatchewan, and the College of Law for hosting the lecture.
Thanks. Thank you, Marie. Before I introduce our two speakers, I would like to just tell you a little bit of the history of the Stack Lecture and to show you that Mr. Martin is the latest in an illustrious line of speakers. In 1989, the law firm of McKercher & Company established an endowed fund to support a lecture series at the College of Law in memory of John A. Stack. Today marks the 8th John A. Stack Memorial Lecture. The inaugural Stack Lecture, A Life in the Law, was delivered by the Honorable Chief Justice Brian Dixon in 1992. And then periodically, we have had significant speakers come to the school, and that's currently part of the McKercher Lecture Series. I'll quickly go through the list of previous speakers, and I'll give you an idea of the sort of caliber of the speakers. The second speaker was Professor Ronald Dworkin. The third was Professor Charles Taylor. Then we had Leon Panetta, who was American Secretary of Defense. We had Peter Lougheed, Phil Fontaine, and Preston Manning. It's a very illustrious group of speakers, and we're delighted that Mr. Martin could join us and add to that illustrious list. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guests. First, our MC, the Honorable Roy Romano, has served in public office in Canada for over 30 years and held a number of prominent political leadership roles. He was Deputy Premier and Attorney General of Saskatchewan between 1971 and 1982, and he played a key role in the federal-provincial negotiations that resulted in the Constitution Act of 1982, which includes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He was Leader of the Opposition from 87 to 91 and Premier of Saskatchewan between 91 and 2001. Following his tenure as Premier, Mr. Romano was appointed head of the Royal Commission on the Future of Healthcare in Canada, which resulted in the final report, Building on Values. And in 2016, he was elected Chancellor of the University of Saskatchewan for a term of 3 years. I should also add he is a proud alumnus of the College of Law, but he will not let me tell you what year he graduated. Please join me in welcoming Roy Romano.
It took several years.
Yeah. Yes, he's always told me that law school was the best 7 years of his life. Now to our guest speaker. The Right Honourable Paul Martin served as the 21st Prime Minister of Canada from 2003 to 2006. During his tenure as Prime Minister, amongst other achievements, he installed a 10-year, $41 billion plan to improve healthcare and reduce wait times, signed agreements with the provinces and territories to establish the first national early learning and childcare program, and created a new financial deal for Canada's municipalities. Under his leadership in November 2005, the Canadian government reached a historic consensus with Canada's provinces, territories, First Nations, Métis and Inuit leaders that would eliminate gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians in the area of health, education, housing and economic opportunities in an agreement that was known as the Kelowna Accord. Mr. Martin also introduced the Civil Marriage Act, which redefined the traditional definition of marriage to include same-sex couples. Since leaving public office, he has created the Capital for Aboriginal Prosperity and Entrepreneurship, the CAPE Fund, for investing in Indigenous business. He founded the Martin Family Initiative, the MFI, focusing on the early childhood and elementary and secondary education of Indigenous children and youth. And he was founding co-chair of the Congo Basin Forest Fund, a $200 million British, Norwegian, Canadian poverty alleviation and sustainable development fund for the Congo Basin rainforest. We're delighted that Mr. Martin today will be focusing on Indigenous education. We have a proud history of this college since 1973, when the Native Law Centre was opened, of being a leader in Indigenous legal education in this country. The Native Law Centre, which is outside over there, has had over 1,000 Indigenous students come through its doors since 1973, and over 75% of all the Indigenous lawyers in Canada have began their legal education in the Native Law Centre. And just this September, as part of our continuing commitment to Indigenous legal education, we opened a law school in Nunavut. We have 25 law students currently studying in Iqaluit, and 80% of those students are Inuit. So it's a great synergy that Mr. Martin is here to speak on issues of Indigenous education. So please welcome me, and please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Paul Martin.
Does this microphone work? Incredible. With the permission, Prime Minister, of you and our chair, the Dean, I'd like to just draw to the attention of the large crowd that is assembled here two other very prominent people. The Mayor of the City of Saskatoon, Charlie Clark, is present, and my successor, former Premier Lorne Calvert, who's now at St. A's College, and everybody here is very prominent. But they stuck out their necks to get accepted or rejected by the public, so I notify their youth of that danger. I also want to, if I can, Prime Minister, with your permission, say that I'm very honored to be asked to, quote, chair this. You and I go back a long way, and I think in a very good way. We've had our disagreements, which is the case. The 1995 budget, I still have some concerns that you... Mind you, you probably had the concerns of my budget in 1995, which wasn't very good. But the Martin family really has contributed a tremendous amount of public policy and hard work, not only for Canada, but beyond. Paul Martin Sr. was an exceptional Minister of the Federal Crown, as you will know, was a leadership contender. I think it was in 1967 or in thereabouts. And at one point was pivotal getting national health care implemented in Canada. I know this to be the case because I was asked to give a lecture at St. FX University, where one of the guest speakers there was in the name of the former prominent Minister of Health in the Pearson government. He wanted to come up and say a few words. And he described how in the minority government of Mr. Pearson, your dad was instrumental in getting national Medicare implemented. Of course, that is something which resonates with my feelings, and I think with the people of Saskatchewan, and most importantly, a nation-defining program for Canada. So you've contributed, and your family has contributed a great deal, and we're very honored to have you here. Now, that being the case, let's get at some of the tough questions. And I want to just begin by drawing to everybody's attention that Paul Martin's family has begun an Indigenous education initiative, which I think is a very important initiative, and especially will be more important as we see time unfold. And I think we should begin there, and I'm going to ask you just to tell us a little bit about your family's Indigenous education initiative.
Well, thank you very much, Premier. It has occurred to me. I will answer your question, but I cannot. First of all, I see Lauren, and then I see you, and then I suddenly realize that you get to ask the questions, and I have to provide the answers. And I wonder, what in God's name am I doing here? But I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Dean, and I would expect maybe some protection. I also want to say what a thrill it is for me to be here in this law school building. I mean, this was, as we discussed just before we came down here, the first law school to recognize the concept of Aboriginal law, and so that it is to be talking in this room about the subjects that we're going to be talking about with you, Premier, I think is wonderful. In terms of our initiative, I think maybe the best thing that I could do is to just perhaps tell you about a couple of our programs, which I think will give you an indication. The first program that I would talk to you about is, in fact, the first program that we brought in. It's called the Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurship Program. It has been a huge success for a number of reasons, not the least of which the person who made it a success is Yves Bousquet, who is sitting right there, who is one of my guys, Premier. Yeah. But essentially, the reason that we formed, created the Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurship Program was that the recognition that most high school students know very little about business. But when they go to high school, there are business courses which essentially open up the opportunities that exist within the economy. There are very few Indigenous schools in this country which open up those same opportunities. And so what we decided was that this was important, and we started in a small school in Thunder Bay, which was serving all of those communities down the shores of Hudson's and James Bay, fly-in communities, and then they would come to this school, and the course was a success. We then took it to Winnipeg, and at that point we began to understand that there was a lot that we had to learn. The course was now well established, at least in these two schools, and a young boy, a Cree, came to me from northern Manitoba, and he said, "You know, Mr. Martin, we really like your course, but your teacher, this is a course for Indigenous students, and how come every single one of your examples are from Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and there isn't one Indigenous person in a role model position?" It was at that point that the light went on, and we asked two of our teachers if they would take off 2 years, and we wrote and produced the first set of Indigenous workbooks and textbooks teaching high school business ever produced anywhere in the world, which goes to show you that in terms of Indigenous people, the degree to which we live in a world all by ourselves when we don't fully understand. The course, as a result of this, has been a huge success, and when I made the reference to Saskatchewan, it has been a success primarily because of Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan school boards then invited us to come to Saskatchewan. And we are now in some 40 schools, 42 schools, Yves, I think it is, across the country, 12 of which are in Saskatchewan. And the course is doing incredibly well. And it demonstrates something that the second program that I'm going to describe to you, I think, really called for. The second program that I will describe essentially starts with the basic premise, and that is if you can't read and write by the end of grade 3, your chances of graduating from high school are virtually nil. If you look at essentially across the country, if by the end of grade 3, on reserve schools, approximately 13% of the students can read and write. If you look at least the province of Ontario, who set a standard, 70% of Ontarians can read and write by the end of grade 3, which basically shows you the difference between the Indigenous students face going in to the rest of their primary schools and to their high schools. And what happened in Ontario was about 30 years ago, Ontario essentially recognizing that they were in very bad shape in terms of reading and writing, took their 100 worst schools, none of them were Indigenous, took their 100 worst schools and spent a lot of money turning those schools around with a major literacy program. That's what brought them up to this level. So when we learned this, we went to the Ontario government, asked them if we could have the program, and asked them if we could have the people who implemented it in Ontario. And we took the program, we took the people that we had implemented it, and we took it into two schools in southwestern Ontario and adapted the course to those two schools. And just to show you what happened, those two schools had 13% of their kids could read and write by the end of grade 3 compared to the 70% in Ontario. At the end of 4.5 years, which was the length of the program, in both schools, the numbers who could read and write was 81%. They beat the provincial average. But what is really important, and it puts the entrepreneurship program into context and everything else, and why it is so important and what really motivates us, is that when the announcement was made of the 81%, the chief of Kettle and Stony Point, which was where one of the schools was, basically got up in front of the audience, an audience much like this, and this chief is a big guy. I mean, I would not want to run into him in a back alley. I would certainly send you, Roy.
Well, nothing new there.
And he just stood up in front of the audience, and the tears rolling down his face. He was so proud of what his students had, and he looked out at the people and he said, you know, you guys don't think our students can do it, but look what we can do when you give us the tools to do it. And that, if there's anything that motivates what we are doing now, whether it be youth entrepreneurship or other programs, it is the necessity of giving the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit the tools to do the job. Because if we do that, they will do anything any other Canadian can do.
Well, that is certainly a very comprehensive and nice overview answer, if I may say so, Prime Minister, to lead us into some other questions. By the way, this is the last introduction of people in the audience that I'm going to make, although everybody's just saying. Leah Hennique is the chair of our Board of Governors at the University of Saskatchewan, and good to see Lee here. So this is a very, I'm reluctant to ask this question, but I'm going to, given your answer. What new programs do you have on the drawing board? Seems to me like the drawing board is pretty complete, but you're obviously thinking about other additional important plans.
You'll notice that I talked about a high school program, and then I talked about a primary school program. But in many ways, the real issue that Indigenous Canadians face was best summarized by Cindy Blackstock, whom many of you know, when she said that the real issue Indigenous adults face is the fact that they spend so much of their lives recovering from their childhoods. And the fact is, we all understand that the brain is formed that first day of pregnancy through to the age of 5. This is when the structures are set in the brain. This is when the brain develops. And this is when, more than likely, the opportunities that you're going to have in the rest of life you will be in a position to take advantage of them, or you will not. And if you couple that with the unfortunate statistic that Philpott quoted the other day, is that 50% of all the student, of all of the young, 50% of all of the kids in foster care in this country are indigenous. And the vast majority of them are not in indigenous foster care families. And that statistic alone tells you the issues that we have. And so what we decided has to be done is that we really have to go where life begins. And that is from the first day of pregnancy to the age of 5. And we went across the country speaking to communities across the country about how should we do it. There are enormous number of indigenous experts in this country, most of whom are in policy, most of whom are not in government, but most of whom are in policy schools in the universities, as to what we should do. And we essentially came up with what is called the Home Visitor Program. And that is that we will go in, this is a program that we're about to go into our first community, probably right after Christmas. But the idea is to go into the community and essentially hire, these would be paid jobs, women in their 30s and 40s who have raised their own families, but they are from the community, and who basically provide them with a training program which we have developed in conjunction with the McCain Foundation, who, those of you who know what Fraser Mustard was, essentially took over from Fraser Mustard, and Red River College in Winnipeg. And it would be a 6-week program teaching these visitors, who would then go knock on a door, say, Sally, I've been told by the school or by the church or by somebody that you're pregnant, and I'm just here to tell you that if there's anything that I can do to help you through your pregnancy, I am here. I'm here 5 days a week if you want me. I'm here 2 days a week if you want me. At the same time, through to your pregnancy, and then I will stay with you for the next 2 years thereafter. And at the same time that we do this, we're going to set up a talking circle of pregnant mothers, or pregnant young women and mothers-to-be, which will meet once a week. We will bring in experts, and we will work with you. And then at the age of 2, we will set up a play school where your children can learn to play, can play among themselves, and then we will set up a preschool before going into kindergarten. This is a program that has been tried in one community in Canada. Other communities have tried parts and parcels of this. But what we're basically doing, we've gone across the country and basically said we're going to take the best that's being offered and we're going to offer it into a comprehensive program. And at the same time, we have done the same thing where it exists elsewhere. And we want to introduce this program. It will be run by the community. We will be very much a junior partner in this. It will be run out of the health authorities in individual communities. And we hope, if in fact the results that we're able to obtain are those mirrored by others who have tried this kind of thing, we would hope to be able to demonstrate that in fact that your beginnings from pregnancy to the age of 5 do not have to be the way that Cindy Blackstock compared them. Now, we're going to add programs to this. To simply give you an example, let's not kid ourselves. There are problems of abuse. There are problems of addiction. There are problems with many of these young mothers are going to have. But the fact is, we cannot just simply allow people to come in, social welfare to come in, and take those children away. The battle has to be to protect the mother and hopefully to give the mother time to turn around. So, one of the things that we will do will work with the daycare. Many of these communities have daycare. If not, we'll install it to work with the daycare, except that the daycare would be where we would send the baby during the day to be taken care of, while the young mother was either able to go back to school and complete her schooling, or where the young mother could take addiction treatment or whatever it was required. But essentially, we are going to fight as hard as we possibly can for that mother and hopefully that father to basically keep the baby, so that in fact the baby does not find himself or herself far away. Now, as we go on, what we're finding is there are new things developing, and that our goal is to basically, we will take any idea that anybody else has that will work. And I'm going to tell you something that happened to me yesterday. I got here earlier. I had to lift weights to get ready to meet Roy, and it's really interesting that the dean talking today about this being the first law school where there was an Indigenous program. I was at your Faculty of Medicine, and I'm sure most of you know about this, but to the extent that you haven't, I'll tell you about it. There is in the surgery department, under the ownership or under the leadership of a Dr. Mendez, there is a program that is essentially using robotics for distance medicine. It is one of the most, I spent the afternoon there, it is one of the most impressive things that I've ever seen. And let me give you simply the reason why. The fact of the matter is, at the present time, if you live up in the northern part of any province, the far northern part of any province, and you are a pregnant woman, 6 to 8 weeks before you deliver your baby, you are taken down to a birthing center down south. You are forced to leave your family back up there, and you live 6 to 8 weeks at this birthing center before eventually you can give birth in case there is a problem. Now, one of two things happens. Either that happens to you with all of the problems that are going to occur, or in fact, as a young mother, you say, I'm not going, and I'm going to take a chance, and if I'm going to have a tough birth, well, so be it. Neither one of those is an adequate answer. What they can do now, and what at the University of Saskatchewan, what they have demonstrated is using robotics. That mother can stay up north, and they don't need the kinds of obstetrician or pediatrician that in fact would do that job, but they can do it by robot from here. And I saw it happening, and I didn't see it happening with a real birth, but what I did see, although it makes the story better, but I saw how it can work, and I must say that if this can be brought to bear, we can then change, in my opinion, so much of the birthing problems that exist up north, and we also can begin to solve so many of the education problems that exist in the far northern climates. It's one thing to turn around a situation that exists in southern Saskatchewan, yes, but it's a heck of a different thing to turn around up north. And we know a little bit about northern Saskatchewan. The literacy program that I talked to you about earlier, we're now in Stanley Mission, for instance, up in Saskatchewan, and with all of the problems that one runs into. No, but we are having tremendous success. And so I guess the point that I would really make is that I really believe that the problems that the First Nations have faced are the reason that they have said, we destroyed parenting, we destroyed their customs. And when I was talking about the program that we're dealing with the young people, it was said to me, the best that was said to me was by an elder in a community in southern Alberta when we explained it to him. And I started to explain it to him, and in terms, I think, that made it very clear that he didn't understand what I was talking about. And he interrupted me in a minute, and he said, young man, let me tell you, you're telling us about something we know. You're telling us about our own traditions. It was the family and the community that raised our children. And you took that away from us. So now what you can do is help give it back. And I can tell you, if we can do that, then I'm going to feel very good about where we're going.
Well, I think it's a terrific statement of objective and intent. I'll ask, by the way, open up for a few questions from the audience here, but I have one more last one, Prime Minister, if I may. And this is a little bit off topic, although it's all in the sphere that we're discussing here. There is much talk about a split at INAC and INAC responsibilities federally between government relations with Indigenous Canada under Carolyn Bennett. You know her very well. I've also had very good dealings with her when I was Premier. And government Indigenous services under Jane Philpott. And it puzzles me a bit as to the split, the reason for the split. I thought I'd throw this question out to you to see how you react to it and what you think the potential is, the benefit is, or any other thoughts that come to your mind on this? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, Roy, I'm really very supportive of this split, and I'll tell you, I will tell you why. First, we've got two strong ministers, and they've now divided it up. Let's just deal with Carolyn Bennett's part first. The Indian Act is, without any shadow of a doubt, the worst piece of legislation that was ever brought down by anybody, anywhere, anytime. I don't think there's a person in this room that would be prepared to live under the conditions of the Indian Act. We're not going to get rid of the Indian Act unless we have replaced it. And the only way in which we're going to replace it is that we recognize the inherent right of self-government. If the inherent right of self-government is supported, which, as we all know from the Supreme Court, is not something we give the First Nations. It is something that, in fact, they have for the fact that they've been here since time immemorial. And the way in which Carolyn Bennett is going to succeed is if, in fact, we establish the inherent right of self-government, we let it work, and as it works out, it will simply make the Indian Act superfluous, and we will get rid of it. Now, on the second one, it is overwhelmingly important. This is the one that Jane Philpott now has in terms of delivering these services. Now, look, there is no excuse. I mean, if you take a look, we all blame the residential schools, and there's no doubt about what the residential schools did. But the fact is that the residential schools started to be phased out in the 1960s, and we know what happened in the 1960s with the 60s scoop. And all that's happened really since the 1960s is that government has continued to underfund education, continued to underfund health care, continue to underfund child welfare, just right across the board, which is the reason that people like ourselves have got to come along and say, let us help you with the literacy course. Not because people couldn't have done it. It's because we gave them about 40% of the funding that they required. So what Jane Philpott has to do right now is to take the services, whether it be drinking water, whether it be housing, or whether it be decent education, decent welfare, and decent health care. But let me just say something. There's going to be a huge objection here. Oh my God, this is going to cost a lot of money. All right. Now we all know the argument against that, which says, well, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to educate people than it is to put them in jail. But I think there is an even more powerful argument, and it is one that you and I talked about last night. But a fellow called Don Drummond, who was in the Department of Finance, which is really a group of very compassionate and generous people, has come out with a paper about a month ago. And essentially what he has said is that for the first time in history, there are more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 14. That is a staggering number if you're looking at where the Canadian economy is going. 34 million people, and we're aging, and we're competing with people with hundreds of million people. We cannot afford to waste anybody. We've got to give everyone the opportunity. Now, he also went and studied. They got 4%. You've got 4% of the Canadian population are Indigenous people. His numbers demonstrate that given the fact that this is the youngest and fastest growing segment of the population, in 30 years, if that 4% is given equal shot at education with the rest of Canada, that 4% will provide 20% of the Canadian workforce. Now, for what country would conceivably underfund education, underfund health care of 20% of their workforce? Nobody would in their right mind. So in my opinion, the argument about how much this is going to cost is that Jane Philpott is not a social affairs minister. She's an economic minister. What she is going to be spending her money on is the difference between an economy that is going to work and an economy that will not work. And I can tell you that, if you put that argument to the Department of Finance, they'll fund it.
Well, powerful. Coming from a former Minister of Finance federally, he knows what he's talking about in that regard. Now, Prime Minister, would you take a few questions from the audience before we adjourn? We have another function that he has to attend tonight. So I'm not trying to make this too short, but obviously the Prime Minister's agenda is hectic, to put it mildly. So what I'd ask you to do is just to stand up or raise your arm and identify. Is the process here, Dean, to microphone over there, and do you identify yourself to the identify who you are, and then put the question. Remember, all the tough questions go to our guest. I get none of them, right? I'm just going to be the chair here. So who wants to begin? Please, let's start and get some points of view or additional comments based on Prime Minister's comments and lectures. Very thoughtful and very provocative, and also, if I may say so, who am I to say so, knowledgeable. The scope of the knowledge here is really very impressive. Yes, sir, the name?
My name's Pierre Hawkins.
Okay, and just a little bit closer to the microphone. So
I'm sorry, my name's Pierre Hawkins.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming to the College of Law. We're happy to have you. My question is this. Obviously, you took a pretty unique and innovative approach to putting together the Kelowna Accord. Do you think there's anything that the current government could learn or use from that approach in its current approach or dealings with Aboriginal peoples?
Yes, I do. I think that essentially what happened in the Kelowna Accord is at the first meeting that was held, it was after a health meeting. In fact, when we were debating Roy's, I think, very welcome report, we basically said to the assembled leaders, there was the five leaders of the five major associations. On behalf of the premiers, I basically said, look, we're not going to tell you what the issues are. You tell us what the issues are. And we will accept them without argument, which is, so they basically set the issues. And then we said, we're not going to tell you what the solutions are. We may disagree with you on the solutions, but what we're going to do is to set up these separate tables. You remember this. And what happened was they set up tables on welfare, issues on health care, and the various issues. But the big difference was, and this is primarily in terms of the First Nations, it could have been 3 months of negotiations. It took 18 months. But the reason for it was every month or two months, one of the tables would say, we're stopping. We've got to go back and consult with our people. And so we said, fine. And they would go back and they would consult with their people, and then they would come back and they'd say, we agree with this, but we don't agree with this, or you've got to do this. So that by the time the 18 months came around, fundamentally all the consultation had been done. And when we all sat around that table, the premiers, the territorial leaders, and we said, okay, we agree on this, which was essentially a framework. You remember that. It was essentially a framework going ahead with objectives. We arrived at the solution. That's why it was such a success. I think that what's going to happen on a number of these kinds of, the negotiations with the governments are not going to take overnight. And I think that what's going to happen is they will have to adopt somewhat a similar process. The biggest problem will be, and I can tell you right now, just think about where the First Nations are. What is a First Nation? As an example, there's going to be a huge pressure put on the First Nations to come forth, and they're going to want to do a lot of discussing, and they've got to be given the opportunity to do it. But where they don't have to is the government, the underfunding of the basic social programs. That's got to start right now.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Okay.
No follow-up there? No? Okay. Next, then, I see another microphone. Yes, name, please.
Laura Tremblay. All the discussions in this series have held a legal lens, with all of the previous prime ministers participating in the series also lawyers. And legal initiatives recently presented at the U of S include justice health partnerships between legal professionals and healthcare providers that may facilitate increased access to justice, particularly in rural areas. Yet, as you mentioned to quite a large degree today, the extreme problems faced by marginalized people, particularly in the northern regions of our country, are so extensive, so pervasive, and so long-standing that various sets of justice health partnerships cannot in and of themselves fully address these extreme problems that include, as you mentioned, rampant addiction, spread of infectious disease, and ensuing healthcare expense as an attempt to manage these problems. So you may interpret my question as a rhetorical one in its large scale, but really based on your experience and as concrete as an answer as you are able to provide is what I'm seeking. So related to your very strong beliefs expressed this afternoon of the necessity of giving tools of education and family support, root cause address to lots of the challenges in healthcare. Related to your work in global health, how might you envision upstream policy to form for its translation into law that enforces not only universal access to a sick care system that exists predominantly in non-remote locations, but law that enforces universal access to preventative and health promotive services that protect Canadians' innate health, as you described, from conception to the first 5 years of brain development as one of their fundamental human rights? This is my question. I know it's huge, but I had to come prepared. And when I read about your background, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to ask you. So as best as you're able to answer, thank you.
Well, okay, let me, while I desperately think of an answer, let me, but are you essentially saying, should government legislate standards in these areas? Is that essentially what it is?
Yes, I'm happy to hear what you have to say in terms of how there could be upstream social determinants of health policy translate into law, as we have had in the law aspects of healthcare for the last 50, 60 years.
I think that you can legislate funding levels. I think you can. And I think that if necessary, I think we should. I don't think that you can legislate outcomes, obviously. And so, for instance, if what you're talking about is, let's say, up north, and you're talking about could we legislate the kinds of things that are being done by the robotics section over here, I don't think we could. But I think that what we could do is once they've demonstrated what they're able to do, then you can legislate that the equipment's got to be in place, that the birthing centers have got to be there to do the kinds of things that are done. So off the top of my head, and I had not given the question sufficient thought, is I think that you can legislate funding. I think that you can legislate standards. We can't legislate outcomes because, in fact, we're not as knowledgeable as we should be. So let me, having answered your question as best as I could, what do you think?
Oh, no, thanks. Because it's not so much, perhaps my question came across that way in terms of legislating outcomes. That wasn't my intention. It's more of an access to preventative health promotive services. As you mentioned, the home visitor program or you had mentioned a couple of different programs underway, but in terms of right now where there's universal access to people that have secondary, tertiary centers available to them in the non-remote areas, that's legislated. So how about having legislated access to disease prevention and health promotion services?
Look, and I think the point that you made right at the very beginning is that I don't think we have spent nearly the amount of time on prevention that we have in trying to deal with the situation afterwards. I think that the focus has got to be on prevention. And that's what I would really take out of what you have just said. And to the extent that you could legislate the preventive measures, I'm not sure how much you can do. You can do that in terms of physical installations up north, and I think that's what it's going to take. You know, as an example right now, the inability of half those northern communities to have any internet access or any access to any of the kinds of things that the programs that they're talking about over at the hospital could do, I think is the kind of thing that you could legislate, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think I've...
No, may I just make one comment, Prime Minister, just because I'm not being answered or asked to give any answers, but I was involved in something after the Royal Commission report, and I don't want to make this too repetitive, but the Prime Minister was very, very important in getting much of it implemented. One of the subject matters was something called the Canadian Index of Well-Being, namely the preventative upstream cares, just generally, which is what I think you're talking about, or not.
Yeah, that's an example of some numeric quantification that can be managed in terms of
Right.
having policy.
Well, all that I want to say is, and I'd like to hear what the Prime Minister has to say about this thing, my own reaction was that there was, I'm not talking now in terms of Indigenous issues and the Indigenous community, that is not my expertise, but the belief in modern day science that we can live any way we want to live and put on weight, not exercise, all of these indicators of life would somehow be treated by some pill or some mechanical or other operation. In other words, there was a mindset that we had to break through, that indices of well-being, good nutrition, exercising, housing, familial relationships is a real tough one. And I wouldn't, here I do not speak for the Prime Minister, it's not limited to First Nations and peoples at all.
No.
This is something which permeates our entire society. I'm sorry I'm not answering here, but that's my 1 cent contribution. So
No, I think you're putting your finger on it. That you should be able to legislate things that you can do. When I was in finance, it was really when you were doing. We had huge arguments on measuring well-being, and the real problem was, can you do it? That was the real problem. So, getting as close as you could to what you're talking about. But if you were to say you've got to legislate well-being, and as you know, that debate goes on now, I'm not sure that that's possible.
No, except that it is possible to diagnose different levels of wellness and to have, like you mentioned today, education and these concrete tools that we know have ripple effects in positive ways that offset the issues that are out of control essentially for decades downstream in the outpatient clinics and acute care environments.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
You know,
now
ju-
we'll.
Can I just say one?
Yep.
Just think, I go back to this thing about the cost, which drives me nuts because it's really lousy economics. Just think about if we are arguing about what you just talked about, as opposed to whether that we can afford it, because I don't think we can afford not to do it. So, good for you.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Martin. Pardon me, sorry. My name is Chris Seacott. Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Thank you very much, Mr. Romano. More so of a couple of statements that I want to make. I chair the Kitutuminak Council at Oskayak High School here in Saskatoon, which is one of the schools that participates in the Martin Family Initiative. And I just want to thank you, first of all, for that, Mr. Martin. I've been the privilege of honor of being the chair of that committee now for the last 4 years. And one of the things that we have seen, and I don't know if you're familiar with Oskayak, but the success rate that we've had in terms of our graduation rates over the last few years. 4 years ago, we had 20 students that graduated. The last 3 years, we've had in excess of 50 students that have graduated. 2 years ago, we had 75. Thank you. And in no small part, the impact that the Martin Family Initiative has had in order to increase entrepreneurship amongst the students has been a great success. I can see that on behalf of the faculty and the leadership of the school. Another organization that I've been involved with, and Mr. Martin, you're very familiar with this as well, is AFOA Canada. I'm the board chair presently of AFOA Canada as well. And in February, we had our national conference in Calgary, and Mr. Drummond was our speaker and specifically spoke on the First Nations economy. It was the first conference of its type that actually talked about the economic impact of First Nations. And he did bring forward the issue that you brought up there with regards to especially the Aboriginal economy. And then specifically the impact that it has in 2 provinces, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. If we are effectively able to engage our First Nations community, the economic impact for our 2 provinces is significant. You've probably all heard the reports on that. But the proper way to engage employment strategies, education, that all has to be taken into consideration as well. Like the Saskatchewan could be a potential economic powerhouse if we're actively engaged in working with First Nations and if we're actively allowing them the opportunities to participate in the environment. Those are my 2 comments. My question for you. My full-time position is working for a financial institution, and I deal specifically with First Nations. Part of the issue that I see on a daily basis is to your point, the growing gap between funding versus the actual needs on reserve. And First Nations don't have the luxury of taxation. So there's only really 2 ways if they run into deficit problems that gets financed. Either it gets backed into their payables, so their suppliers end up having to pay for it, or get backed into operating lines with their financial institutions, which then in turn becomes a debt issue. And that's part of the issue that we're running into right now, is we're seeing escalating increases in debt with our First Nations just to make ends meet, if you will, from an economics perspective. So, Mr. Martin, my question for you then is this. How can the government, you have framed it in terms of an economic framework, and that's correct. That's the way that it has to be done. But what can we do more in terms of financial industries, banks, credit unions, et cetera, to assist First Nations in meeting those goals? Thank you.
Well, I think, to be quite honest, I think that the banks, I think if you take a look at what the banks have said, and you know Harold Kyle out west, and sort of what they're doing in terms of those kind of financial institutions, I think that they make, and they are making a great deal of progress. I think you've got to involve, I think business has got to get much more involved. The problem that really exists is that because of the natural resource industries, businesses involved a lot more out west than they are in central Canada. And I think it is really the failure. I mean, there was a study done that was released about 3-4 days ago that showed that really 85% of business is not involved in the Indigenous issues. And I think that business has got to become far more involved. But at the same time, the communities are going to have to develop a lot more of their own internal revenues in the creation of business.
Yeah, capacity building is obviously an issue. You're referring to the Inspire report that came out last week?
That's exactly right, yeah.
Which is out of here in Saskatchewan. And of course, the other issue that is specific and very unique to the Prairie provinces is the NRTA, the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, which basically puts the onus back on the provinces. So there's a spot where the province is going to have to play in this part as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That was very innocent. All these are. Next, please. Name and...
Leon Thompson, Mr. Premier, Prime Minister, various titled guests. I'm finding that, having studied law for so long, I see the routes that could be taken to make meaningful change with regard to the Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationship. But I find that the larger, more pressing structural concern is the worldview gap, the cultural gap. I don't see just simple building materials. These are the bones of a relation, just like the water in your bottle or the plants on the desk. And not everybody sees it that way. How have you, or what can non-Indigenous Canadians do to address their own personal worldview cultural gap?
Well, I think that the approach that we should be taking is that there is a cultural gap. My advice to any educator or to any younger person is that what you're seeing coming out of the push, the very legitimate push for Indigenous education and for Indigenous schools, where the language and the culture is going to be taught, is that if we don't establish a partnership between us, there's going to develop a huge chasm between First Nation students or Métis or Inuit with their cultural approach, understanding where other Canadians' culture are coming from, but other Canadians not understanding where this very young part of the population is coming from in terms of their cultural position. The second thing is that I think that right now the First Nations, in terms of their own cultural approach, is to sort of say, this is ours, we are going to develop it, but no attempt made to share the view. And so I can only talk a little bit about this, but let me just go through it, because I have talked to Canadians about this. The basic view that Canadians have was one that they inherited from the very first settlers who got here when they, 600, 700, 800 years ago, when they were looking for China and thought it was India. The fact of the matter is that, and they ignored what was to be said. Well, that can no longer be, and the reason it can no longer be is that, in fact, a lot of the Indigenous cultural positions are now very much pertinent today. As an example, climate change. The fact of the matter is, Donald Trump can say, I'm walking away from this agreement. Why can he say he's walking away from this agreement? Because the basic cultural position of non-Indigenous people is that we are above nature. That's what we were all taught. All of us that went to school, I certainly was taught that I was above nature. That's not where the Indigenous and Canadians come. They come from we are part of nature. Well, the fact of the matter is there is no philosophy that can deal with climate change unless you accept that we are part of nature, that we are not above nature, and it cannot be, it can't be our servant any longer. There's one, that's one example. Second example, the fact is, you know, that just if you want to look at it, for God's sake, you know, 50, 60 years ago, you went to jail if you were homosexual in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't accepted here. Well, 500 years ago, they recognized that people had two spirits. And the fact is that there was a far deeper understanding. So that in terms of what are we all about, I think that Indigenous culture has demonstrated a position that the rest of us could really learn from. So I think that what really has to happen is that a lot of what is Indigenous culture, the Indigenous thinkers, people like Leroy Littlebear, that some of you know, and some of these kinds of people, ought to be heard from. And that there ought to be be a preparedness to understand. It doesn't mean that non-Indigenous Canadians have got to accept Indigenous culture in these areas, or that Indigenous people have to understand ours. But I'll tell you, as a country, when you look at the size of the Indigenous position compared to the non-Indigenous Canadians, there is going to have to be an understanding of Indigenous culture. And if that happens, then we'll have a much stronger partnership and a much better country.
Thank you.
Could I just ask, I'm not supposed to ask any questions of you, but I'll take a chance that you'll be easy on me. Given the history, with respect to the concept of partnerships, which you've just articulated, one that appeals to me, obviously, I think it to a lot, is there so much history that's preceded it that the barriers to establishing effective working partnerships still remain very high and very difficult to knock down?
I don't think so. I think it comes back. To. I mean, I think that the questions are very, very good one. But I think that if you look at the demographics, they're not. Number one, the Indigenous population is very young. So that in fact we're not dealing with a bunch of old crocs like, yeah. But we're dealing with a lot of young people who are able to do this. And the second thing was, and this is really interesting, I participated, spoke at a Canadian citizenship ceremony in Toronto about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months ago. And I've had this happen in universities, and I had it there. New Canadians have a phenomenal interest in the First Nations and in the questions that they put. And they don't come to this, they don't come to this with the same kinds of prejudices that so many of us have. They come to it with a very open mind. And if we take advantage of that, if they take advantage of that, then I think that we can deal with that. I think the point you raise has been a big problem, but I do think that the demographics can turn it around in our favor. Yes, absolutely.
Next question, please.
Good afternoon. My name's Marie Batiste, and I'm a professor in the College of Education here. And I want to say, first of all, Mr. Martin, that you and I have had wonderful conversations about Indigenous knowledge and about your understanding. And I think that you have expressed that very well as to the last speaker's question. And I'm very happy to hear you talk to the importance of Indigenous knowledge being understood by Canadians at large. And I think that the other thing that I heard you say was that, you know, how horrific residential schools are and were and have been, and the effect it has intergenerationally on Indigenous people. I think that one of the things that we're experiencing today is a backlash toward indigenizing of our academy, indigenizing of the education system. And part of that comes as a result of not that people don't want to understand what indigenous knowledges are or might be, but they don't want to understand what role their ancestry and their histories have been in terms of the people and the policies that have enacted residential schools. The residential schools were indeed a horrific experience, but they didn't appear out of nowhere. They came from policies and practices, and they came from men and women and from people whose ancestries belong in this province and who belong in this Canada. And that's a very difficult, horrific thing that when we put forward who and what that these people have done in that time, it meets with a backlash that that our children are too young to hear about the colonialization of Indigenous people, and that maybe we should put that aside for certain courses and let that be the place where we house Indigenous infusion in education. And so I would like to ask you, what would you say to Canadians about that experience that your children need to learn about not just Indigenous knowledge and the very important elements that you have talked about and we've talked about before, but rather about the very experience and the colonialization of that has been the part of the histories of white Canadians?
Ladies and gentlemen, I am in one hell of a pickle. Let me explain this to you. I have read every single one of Marie Battiste's books. I have learned so much over the years from Marie Battiste. I think that I'm not a bad student, but the fact is I feel like a PhD student suddenly being asked questions at the PhD thing by the person who's going to decide whether they're going to get the PhD. The fact of the matter is that Marie Battiste has probably had as much influence, if not more, on my thinking than has any other person. And for me to answer a question that she asks me is the only thing I think I can really say is, yes, ma'am. So,
Tell them, Paul.
so, what's my answer, ma'am?
You tell them why they need to know their own histories. You tell them that it's important that the very colonization that has been part of white Canadians' ancestry and heritage is something that all of our children, everyone's children needs to understand. And it is not something that should be buried behind nice words about what has happened in the past. And we can't put it all on Indigenous people to be the educators of them, that the white Canadians need to, and other Canadians who have had long histories here, need to educate everyone about that history. And to, if it is part shame, it's coming from your heart, learn from that heart and bring it closer to your head.
Yeah. Well, again, as I said, yes, ma'am. But I very much agree with what you've said in terms of the history. But as you have demonstrated to me, and I think that I probably have demonstrated to you, when you get into the questions of culture, when you get into the questions of not what happened 300 years ago, but what is the worldview today, people have got to hear from people like you. I mean, there is no other alternative. And so that in terms of the tragedy of so much of Canadian history, the terms of all of that, you're absolutely right. That's got to be taught right across the board. There could be no holds barred. I really do believe, however, that if people like yourself, and you have done it so well, but people like yourself and others like you have got to speak out, because without that, it's going to be very hard for a lot of us to understand.
Okay, another question right here.
Hi there. My name is Gary Anaquad. I'm with the Saskatchewan Indigenous Cultural Centre. First of all, I want to thank you for a lot of your work on Indigenous issues, Prime Minister, particularly the Kelowna Accords. In the last few months, the Cultural Centre and a lot of communities, First Nations communities and leadership across the country have been involved with the Federal Indigenous Languages Act. They're hoping to pass it next year. One of the concerns that we've seen expressed that we feel strongly about, great, we're going to have an Indigenous Language Act, we'll have mechanisms for revitalization, but what happens if the government changes? How can we idiot-proof the legislation? as one of our concerns, the example I would give is, after the Kelowna Accords, we had really substantially increased funding for Indigenous language education. And then in 2005, with the then Conservative government, Minister Bev Oda cut it to the bone. And we just see the years since then, it's just been a real loss. We really have continued to see erosion of Indigenous languages. But one of the factors, a big factor from our perspective, is that substantial cutting that the Conservative government did to language revitalization in 2005. We could have done so much in those years with that money that was cut. So basically, I'm asking, how can we, even with the splitting of INAC, how can we ensure these changes persist through changes of government?
As much as possible, you got to go in and put in the legislation. What happened in the case of the Kelowna Accord was we had the agreement. We all came to the agreement, the premiers, the territorial leaders, everyone, but it was not legislation. We had set the framework, everything was done, but then the election occurred, there was no legislation because the Kelowna Accord ended and the election took place within a very short period of time. So whatever you want to get, I think the only answer is to get it into legislation.
Thank you.
And if I may add, Prime Minister, my own view, just listening to your answer, the Martin Family Indigenous Education Initiative is very important. There needs to be education about the history and the injustices and the opportunities going forward. We just don't have enough of that. Why I think this person seated to my right, former Prime Minister's candidate, taking on this cause is so important is because exactly that's what you're doing, Mr. Prime Minister. And we need more of this discussion. And I think as a conditioned precedent with education, there comes more of an attitude for change, an acceptance of change. Well, that may be a simple comment that's not relevant, but I think it's very relevant, and I can't help but say that the Martin Family Indigenous Education Initiative has been absolutely our leading national initiative on this #1, I would say #1 challenge that faces our community at large. That's my view. And I think...
Always agreed with you.
First time we've agreed on anything. I think that seems to bring the afternoon to a close. Before I call on Dean Phillipson, who will probably do the same thing that I'm going to call on you to do now, I don't think there's anybody in this hall that will deny a request that we give a very warm hand of applause to a great Prime Minister and a great Canadian who, even after public life, continues to fight the right causes for this country and beyond. Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it just leaves it for me to say thank you again to our wonderful MC, Roy Romano, and to our special guest, Paul Martin. Thanks to Roy. Thank you. And I'd really like to thank you all, and those of you in the other rooms who are watching me downstairs. I think we had 275 people registered and probably got close to 300 people showing up. That's a wonderful testament to the event and to our speakers. So thank you all for coming. And check out the list of the other College of Law events. We have lots of great speakers. So please, the college wants to be part of your intellectual community, wants to be part of the life of the city. So please come by. And again, thank you all for your attendance this afternoon. Have a safe trip home. Thank you.